Good evening. I'm Samuel Huntington. Dean Allison has asked me to chair this meeting and to introduce my good friend, Zbig Brzezinski. Introducing Zbig today is, of course, a pleasure and an honor. It does, however, bring back certain memories of the last time I performed an introduction for Zbig in a building on Boylston Street in Cambridge. And that was about 25 years ago. He and I were both bachelor resident tutors in Kirkland House, right across the street. And one day I had this terrifically attractive date from Wellesley. I introduced Zbig to her, and 5 months later he married her. In the years since, he has accomplished other things, although perhaps none quite as important. He has, however, established himself as a leading scholar of Soviet and communist affairs. He has been the author or co-author of a half-dozen major works, the founder and director of the Research Institute on International Change at Columbia, director of the Trilateral Commission, and a professor of political science at Columbia, a position which he has now resumed after his 4 years in government. Zbig's record of scholarly achievement, I think, speaks for itself. I would, however, like to correct one possibly prevailing misconception about his service, most recently as Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Despite appearances to the contrary, it simply is not true that while in this post, he spent 1/3 of his time on the Great Wall of China, 1/3 of his time in the Khyber Pass, and 1/3 of his time on Meet the Press. In fact, the statistics rather conclusively demonstrate that he gave equal time to Meet the Press and Face the Nation. In all seriousness, however, having served with Zbig at the NSC, I would like to say a very serious word about what he did there, because I think he created at the NSC an environment which was possibly unique in its history. He recruited good people. He urged them to take freewheeling initiatives. He urged them to interact with each other in a lively, exciting, and informal sort of way. And as I know from experience, he backed them up when they got into trouble. He demonstrated, I think, that the effective exercise of power does not require a Germanic hierarchy, and that free and open debate need not result in bureaucratic impotence. And in performing the tremendously important functions of a national security advisor, functions including ensuring that the foreign policy process proceeds in an orderly, responsible, and effective manner, including the generating of new ideas and policy options, including providing some measure of perspective, historical and theoretical, to a president. In performing those functions, I think Zbig performed superbly well. Those are functions which have to be performed if we are to have an effective foreign policy, and I think we are becoming more and more clear on that point, and now that we are beginning to find out what it is like to have a White House without a Brzezinski in it. Zbig, a little less than 2 years ago, you spoke here in Cambridge in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. You return in the shadow of the imposition of martial law and the crackdown on solidarity in your native land. We welcome you back happily. We also welcome you back unhappily at this time of crisis and potential tragedy. But that simply means that we await your words all the more anxiously. The floor is yours. Dr. Brzezinski.
Thank you very much. I want to assure everyone here that since that day 25 years ago, Sam has not introduced me to any more women. I also do want to say that having worked with Sam in Washington confirmed me in the view that being a brilliant theoretical professor is not incompatible with being a ruthless and very successful bureaucratic infighter. And having Sam there was an important asset in the kind of struggles that we had over a variety of issues, some of which I'll be touching on today. Needless to say, I'm very happy to be back at Harvard. I studied here. Harvard represents one of the two periods of my life which were genuinely, personally the most happy and certainly the most creative. The years that I studied here, I can only compare in terms of personal gratification and sense of involvement with the preceding 4 years. And thus being back here brings back very special memories which I associate with buildings, people, and ideas. Sam mentioned I spoke here 2 years ago in my then official capacity after the Soviet action against Afghanistan. I could not help but recall also another occasion I spoke to a large group of students and faculty as a very young assistant professor of government here at Harvard. And it was almost 25 years ago. It was in November of 1956, shortly after the Soviet invasion of Hungary. And thus there are a number of milestones which my memory crosses as I reflect on my various experiences at Harvard, and they do seem to be associated also with important transformations on the international scene. In my remarks today, I intend to touch at some specificity on the events that have been transpiring in Poland and comment on the specter of not only suppression but Soviet intervention that is now overshadowing that land. And I also intend to comment on the events that are transpiring in the Middle East, for in a larger sense both are related to the dilemmas that American foreign policy confronts. But I would like to do so in a wider context and focus, therefore, on some broader considerations before turning to these more immediate issues of general concern. Let me then begin by saying that as I look at the situation of the United States in the world, and as I reflect on the dilemmas that we confront as a nation, and on the dangers which we and the generation that may follow us may face, it is not Soviet domination of the world that preoccupies me. It is not the imposition of a Pax Sovietica, which even in a remote way would approximate that period of history which can be called of Pax Americana, that gives me concern. The fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union is not appealing ideologically, that it is not vital politically, that it is not productive economically, and that it is not creative doctrinally enough to be able to impose such domination and to maintain it. The Soviet system is a sterile, unattractive, and inefficient system. There are many ways of capsulating and capturing its essence. More sophisticated, theoretical, and intellectual ways of so doing, and perhaps more primitive, political, perhaps even slightly demagogic ways of so doing. And once, in speaking to the cabinet, trying to explain to my fellow colleagues how the Soviet system changed over time, I relied on a formulation which fits more the latter than the former category. but which in some respects, I believe, conveys the essence of the nature of the contemporary Soviet system. I said that under Lenin, the Soviet system reminded me of a Shakers revival meeting. A great many people agitated about the future, with a leader on the podium charting the ideal society somewhere beyond the horizon. Under Stalin, it was like a vast prison, with almost everybody on the inside of it, and with large-scale executions in the courtyard almost daily to remind everyone of the importance of discipline and obedience. Under Khrushchev, it was like a large circus. A large number of emaciated, undernourished, and underdressed people sitting in the rafters, watching an act on the flying trapeze, the Sputnik and otherwise, and deriving a great deal of vicarious satisfaction from it. Under Brezhnev, it's like the American post office. People wallowing in paper with little moving anyway. The cabinet also liked it. Bob Strauss went around Washington repeating the story and claiming he invented it. But the point is a serious one. The Soviet system today commands allegiance neither by ideology nor by fear. And thus it is an uncreative, unappealing, inefficient system which could not dominate the world. The Soviet Union is competitive and dangerous in one dimension only, and that is military power. And it is that dimension that gives the Soviet Union a global role, not its ideology. Even 30 years ago, if you turn to revolutionaries around the world and ask them, what is your image of the future? A number of them would still say the Soviet system. Today, no revolutionary anywhere in the world would point to the Soviet system as his image of a future society. But Soviet power gives the Soviet Union the capacity to project its influence in a traditional big nation-state fashion, but in so doing, not only to engage in political intimidation, but also to contribute to greater tensions and to growing instability. Indeed, the promotion of instability tends to be one of the tools of its policy. I urge a closer look at the situation in Turkey over the last few years. It is a remarkable and yet untold story in the West. Some 800,000 weapons infiltrated into a country, many of them highly advanced weapons, for the purpose of destabilizing a strategically sensitive nation. The Soviet Union has the capacity, by contributing to greater world tensions, to prevent this gradual shaping of a new and wider international system, to replace the more narrowly based, Europe-centered system that has dominated world affairs for several centuries, and which came to an end as the cumulative consequence of the two world wars and the Great Depression. Thus, the real danger that the Soviet Union poses is that it may enhance international turbulence and thereby contribute to what I believe is the real danger to the international community and to our own well-being in the future. And that is large-scale global chaos, mounting anarchy, the incapacity of the politically awakened world to devise new structures of cooperation which promote greater equity and social justice between big and small nations, between the established and the new nations. That, I believe, is the central challenge that the Soviet Union poses on the global scene, and in a curious way, through its insistence on antiquated structures, that challenge is also reflected in what is currently happening in Poland. In responding to that challenge as a nation, being as deeply engaged in world affairs as we have been since World War II, we have to be very careful not to become diverted by sideshows or by escapist conclusions about the nature of the problems that we face. I was struck during my own years in the White House how extraordinarily difficult it is for a democracy to pursue a balanced and sustained foreign policy, a policy that is responsive realistically to the continuing requirements of power in a world in which power is still a source of the principal leverage that nation states have, and at the same time to the imperatives of principle, being the kind of society that we are, having made the kind of compact that we have with certain basic principles concerning human nature and the relationship of individual to society. In our society, we tend to be buffeted, in part by mass media, in part by the large-scale participation in the political process, into reactions which tend to be dichotomic, which like to reduce complexity into simple black and white categories, and foreign policy debates into conflicts between hawks and doves. We try thereby, in my judgment, to evade and to escape the challenge of complexity. Worse than that, we periodically take flight from complexity and take refuge in simple and, in my judgment, distortive personalization of the challenge that confronts us. The challenge that confronts us, I repeat, is the enduring, prolonged, and difficult task of shaping an international system in a politically awakened world with a power in it that uses its military might, either deliberately or objectively, to enhance instability. And we, from time to time, in response to this sustained challenge, take refuge in focusing all of our attention and much of our hostility on personal specters that, in my judgment, are demeaning to our own dignity and involve an escape from reality. I speak, first of all, of the 20-year-old tendency to elevate Castro into a principal threat to the United States, the dictator of a small island of 8 million people, and lately, another dictator who rules 2 million people in the distant northern Mediterranean littoral, Gaddafi of Libya. I find something demeaning, but more important than that, disturbing in our periodic preoccupations with these personal symbols that we use as a substitute for recognition of the complexity of this new world in which we live, and which it is so difficult to manage, and with which we have to develop new forms of institutional arrangements if our values are to be preserved and if our interests are to be protected. In facing that dilemma, and it is a continuing and prolonged dilemma, we also have to recognize that our strategic environment has changed and that our thinking about the nature of our geopolitical interests has evolved. I think it is fair to say that in recent years we have entered a new and important phase in the strategic and geopolitical engagement of the United States in this difficult process, which requires, among other things, the maintenance of international stability through common defense policy, through alliance relationships, and through the projection of American power. In the immediate post-war years, our first major engagement focused on what I call the first central strategic zone, the security of which became interdependent with our own, and that is clearly Western Europe. A new and major redefinition of the traditional American definition of our national security occurred when we concluded that Western Europe's security was interdependent with our own. The second important phase took place when an additional central strategic zone came to be recognized in identical terms. And I speak here of the Far East, and notably of Japan and Korea. And here, too, we reached an identical conclusion, to which we proved steadfast by responding to the challenge in Korea. In recent years, in the very recent years, a third central strategic zone, the security and stability of which is interdependent with our own, but more important still, interdependent with the other two, has come to be recognized. And that's the Middle East and the Persian Gulf region. And this represents a new and important extension of our engagement in the quest for global security. But beyond that, there is an additionally important new dimension to that commitment. The first is that unlike our previous commitments in Europe and in the Far East, this commitment leaves us with no luxury of a fallback position. In the execution of our commitment to the security of Europe, we stood fast in the defense of Berlin. We should have, and we did. But I think impartial judgment compels the conclusion that had we lost Berlin, we still could have defended Western Europe, though probably at far greater cost and with much greater effort. Korea is central to the defense of Japan, and we stood by Korea and we defended it. But I think an impartial conclusion leads one to the view that we could have lost Korea and still have defended Japan, though probably with far greater political cost. In the Persian Gulf region, there is no fallback position. If the position that we now have in the Gulf states and in Saudi Arabia were to be undermined from within or from without, there would be an immediate and far-reaching consequence, not only for our vital interests, but much more urgently so for the vital interests of Western Europe and the Far East, and therefore the political outlook and the nature of the relationship with us of these two central strategic zones would thereby immediately be changed. And the second aspect of the new dimension is that in the past we defended our vital interests in Western Europe and in the Far East in a setting of relative and initially absolute strategic superiority. It made that task therefore much easier. Today we're engaged in the task of defending our vital interests in all three zones in a setting strategically that is far more ambiguous than ever before, far less advantageous than ever before, which at best can be explained with the word parity, and regarding which future trends are at best uncertain and in some respects inimical. This makes our efforts more difficult, it makes our steadfastness more critical, and above all, it makes it more important than ever before that our overall strategy be undertaken in common with our friends in Western Europe and Japan. For that relationship of cooperation is all the more central, given not only the interrelationship of the three central strategic zones, but the absence of a fallback in one of them and the complexities and dangers of nuclear parity. Yet serious problems are surfacing in all three zones, and they do affect our interests, and they do make cooperation more difficult. One has read and heard a great deal about the question in Europe today, and there is naturally an understandable dispute how best to define it. Many use the words neutralism or pacifism to describe the present condition in Western Europe. In some respects, these words are applicable. In some respects, they're probably an exaggeration. In some respects, they may be applicable before too long to large segments of the American society as well. For it's likely that many of the manifestations that we associate with neutralism and pacifism in Europe will become stronger in our own society. But beyond that, there is no doubt that a gap in strategic perceptions between us and significant portions of the European public opinion, and in some cases governments, is emerging, in the sense that key issues are beginning to be perceived in significantly different ways. I'm not assigning blame, I'm merely diagnosing a situation which is troublesome, whether it is the Middle East, or Central America, or strategic doctrine, or perhaps before too long, Central Europe, and probably arms control. Significant divergences, probably more extensive than in the past, are surfacing. Beyond that, in two critically important countries, there are some developments which need careful monitoring and diagnosis. It is too early to tell whether the new appearance of neutralist and pacifist tendencies in Germany, in some ways significantly different from the conditions of the late 40s and the 50s, when it was associated with an ideological position, is a lasting phenomenon or merely a passing cyclical manifestation. We cannot yet judge whether pacifism and neutralism that has manifested itself within a spectrum of German younger people reflects perhaps a new expression for German nationalism. But in any case, it does mean the adoption of an outlook which magnifies the gap between the United States and West Germany, a gap which at least for several decades was absent. Beyond that, one has to look carefully at certain political manifestations, which as of themselves may not be troublesome, but which viewed cumulatively may represent a subtle change in existing relationships. What does it mean, for example, that Germany, West Germany, will now have a separate channel to Moscow on arms control issues? Should other allies have similar separate channels? Should Soviet allies have separate channels of this sort with the United States? Or should one particular Soviet ally have such a channel with the United States? We know that that won't happen. We know that neither will it happen that all Soviet allies will have separate channels with the United States. What does it mean for one NATO country to have a separate channel with the Soviet Union on arms control issues, which the United States is negotiating with the Soviets on behalf of the collective allied interests? Perhaps it doesn't mean much, but taken in a larger context, perhaps it is a symptom of something new. What does it mean when the German Chancellor declares, shortly after the announcement of a new American position on arms control, that both the Soviet and the American positions are extreme, and that both will change over time? Is he a neutral kibitzer observing a game between two superpowers, or is he a partner in an alliance? And even though positions do change in the course of negotiations, is it an appropriate position for an ally to take such a posture of Olympian detachment and place in the same box the positions of one's ally as well as the position of one's adversary? Similarly, I wonder whether the American-French relationship in the months ahead will remain as stable and as close as it has become. France, in many respects, is the key country of Europe. It is the genuinely organic nation of Europe, with a genuine sense of national pride and commitment to national defense. In recent years, American-French cooperation on strategic matters has been excellent, and President Mitterrand has assured us that it will continue. But one is justified in asking oneself whether the economic policies of the French government over time may not contribute to internal polarization, which in time will not leave foreign policy considerations unaffected. I think it is at least a legitimate question to raise. For that policy could in time create a new ideological climate in which more significant divergences in foreign policy could emerge, in which indeed it becomes fashionable to be concerned with American policy in Central America and less concerned with the policies of the Soviet Union in Central Europe. All of that could contribute to greater distance between us and our allies at a time when common policy is needed. But the problems in Europe which concern us are not limited to the West. They involve Poland as well. And here it seems to me absolutely central that we focus on the key issue. I believe it is not sufficient, and indeed in some respects misleading, to make the central issue of the events of the last few days the question whether what is happening is being done by the Polish security forces or whether the Soviets are directly involved. To me, the central issue, the overriding issue, should be formulated differently. Are the actions of the last few days designed to assert governmental authority, albeit in a brutal manner, so that on that basis the process of renewal, though perhaps of a more limited type, can continue in collaboration with the principal social forces of Poland, represented particularly by the Church and Solidarity? Or is the action of the last few days undertaken to exterminate Solidarity as a whole, to destroy its leadership, to wipe out its organizational forms, to suppress what it represents, and to restore an authoritarian, indeed a totalitarian system of monolithic ideological control and political submission to the Soviet Union? That, to me, is the key question. If the answer is that it is a more limited action designed to contain Solidarity, then in the very near future, we should see manifestations of that through talks between the Premier, General Jaruzelski, and the head of the Church, the Primate of Poland, and Wałęsa, the head of the trade unions. And not much time is left for that. And the purpose of such talks will be to redress the situation, albeit in a context politically much more favorable to the government, so that the process of renewal for which the country has committed itself can continue. If the action is designed to exterminate Solidarity, it will mean large-scale arrests of the top layers of leadership, subordinate layers, the imprisonment of activists around the country, the destruction of its printing presses, the reimposition of censorship, and perhaps even, if conditions become more dramatic, the physical liquidation of some of the most gifted, talented, creative, and courageous people in Poland. That is the question that we need to raise, and that is what the West ought to be talking about. And it is premature at this stage to conclude that it is the more benign scenario that is being followed in Poland today. I wonder what you in the audience would think of an editorial of this type dated some years ago, General Pinochet's burden. The only thing that is absolutely clear in Chile is that General Pinochet has taken on himself an extraordinary responsibility. For he has not only suspended, as far as is known without bloodshed but with great firmness, the liberties that the country has been seeking. He has also asked millions of Chileans to repose virtually total trust in his pledge to do all that can be done to rescue the country from spiraling in crisis, to continue the reform line and eventually to restore the civilian order, and to do all of that without civil war. It is an awesome charge. To judge by his pronouncements, General Pinochet seems to be quite aware of this. I have perpetrated a small fraud. I have substituted the name Pinochet for Jaruzelski, and I've read you the opening paragraph of the editorial today from the Washington Post. I think it is premature to conclude that General Jaruzelski assumed this burden and that the benign scenario is at work. I think everyone concerned with developments in Poland ought to compare carefully the relatively moderate public pronouncement that he made with the draconic decree that was simultaneously issued. That decree is reminiscent of the regulations imposed on occupied Europe by the Gestapo. All firearms, all hunting equipment, radio transmitters are to be handed in. People cannot move without special ID cards and permission. People cannot assemble. Schools are suspended, and so forth. It is a decree imposing total control on a country in order to regain total control over that country. And thus we may be dealing, and I do not wish to predict, but I think the question has to be raised, with a more malignant scenario, one which involves the extirpation of Solidarity under the cloak of darkness and silence. For it is that which has been imposed in the last 2 days and is still being imposed with increasing severity. We simply do not know what is happening outside of Warsaw, and not much about what is happening in Warsaw itself. We do not know under what conditions the leadership was arrested. We do not know if violence was used when these arrests took place. We do not know the fate of the prisoners. We do not know whether in small towns Solidarity is being forcibly dismantled, its activists incarcerated, or worse. We simply do not know, and I think the West should ask. We should insist on knowing. And we should ask that those who are imprisoned are protected and released and not physically destroyed. And I think we should make it clear that if it is the malignant scenario, namely an action designed to destroy Solidarity, that the Soviet Union is not to be viewed as immune from culpability. Indeed, in some respects, the more dreadful scenario involves Soviet intervention by proxy. For it is clearly an action that the Soviet Union desired and demanded and insisted upon. And it is an action which it is prepared to back by force if the Poles themselves, who are acting on Soviet behalf, cannot carry it out. The information that we have so far is limited, but it seems to indicate that national resistance is going to continue, and the future could become, therefore, more threatening. Wałęsa apparently has been offered an opportunity to speak on national television and to ask the country to desist from general strike, which he has refused to do, and he has been moved to a prison. Forces are concentrating near the strikers that have taken possession of Nowa Huta, the large steel complex near Krakow, while the students in the University of Krakow have barricaded themselves within the university. Preparations apparently are being made for medical treatment of those who may need it in the consequence or as a consequence of action. Wałęsa has demanded an opportunity to speak to his colleagues, which has been denied to him, but some of them have managed to evade the effort to arrest the entire leadership. And by means used during World War II, indirect communication and techniques developed in the underground, the call for a general strike is spreading. And thus it is unlikely that the situation in Poland will quickly become pacified, and that the issue that Poland poses will leave the East-West relationship untouched. It seems to me that we have to recognize that what is happening in Poland has far-reaching consequences for the stability of the East-West relationship, for the Soviet role in the world, and indeed for the evolution of the Soviet system itself. The brutal reimposition of Soviet-type control over Poland is bound to worsen East-West relationships. It will require Western sanctions. I find it hard to believe that an administration in office which has called for a tougher policy towards the Soviet Union could continue with its policy of lifting the grain embargo in that context. But beyond that, within the Soviet Union itself, the consequence is likely to be the revival of the primacy of the secret police and the military, and thus a Soviet Union itself less likely to become a more compatible member of the international community. The problem in the first Central Strategic Zone, both in the West and the East, thus poses a serious challenge to the stable management of the East-West relationship. Problems are also surfacing in the second Central Strategic Zone in the Middle East. And here it seems to me we ought to recognize the fact that it is essential for the United States to be actively involved in the promotion of the peace process. For without active and assertive American engagement, that peace process will stalemate, atrophy, and fall apart. The history of the last few years teaches us that without active and assertive American leadership, the parties concerned cannot move towards peace. The deplorable action of Prime Minister Begin in annexing the Golan clearly is in conflict with the Camp David principles and is going to make the pursuit of peace more difficult. And yet it makes it all the more important that this pursuit be maintained. And that means a more assertive American policy than heretofore has been forthcoming. Otherwise, we face the real danger of a breakdown in the process, of increased political instability in Egypt, and general frustration of our efforts to forge a series of indirect security links with the more moderate Arab states to provide a shield for this vital but increasingly vulnerable region. We mustn't, nor can we, overlook the fact that until a few years ago, from a strategic point of view, this region was sealed off from external threat by a protective tier of states with the northern frontiers of Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan being the demarcating line, and Afghanistan as a useful political buffer. The buffer has become an offensive wedge, and the pivot of that tier, Iran, has disintegrated. And thus our strategic position in the region is far worse than ever before. And without progress on peace, simultaneously with efforts to forge security links, we cannot ensure the stability and the security of the region. And finally, in the Far East, we do face the possible prospect of a significant deterioration in the American-Chinese relationship because of the doctrinally motivated inclination of this administration to engage in a needless rearming of Taiwan with advanced weaponry. I fail to see any strategic need for such an initiative, and I recognize that it will have far-reaching and negative political consequences for the new relationship with the United States and China, and probably over the longer haul also for the relationship between the United States and Japan. And thus our ability to coordinate effectively a common response in the new strategic environment with our allies and friends is threatened by a variety of developments within the three central strategic zones of which I had spoken. All of that, in conclusion, underlines the need not only for a balanced foreign policy, which strikes a moderate relationship between the imperatives of principle, the commitment to human rights, which today is being tested in Poland, and the need to emphasize power. But it calls also for a policy which is better understood by the American public and more widely supported. And that, of course, means the old, the antiquated perhaps, and yet the necessary notion of bipartisanship in foreign policy. We haven't had that for more than a decade and a half, and it certainly is not easy to achieve. Every president wishes to have it, and most presidents in recent years have been unable to achieve it. And the only way to achieve a balanced and bipartisan foreign policy is first by gradualism, by focusing on individual issues in which the leaderships of the two parties are jointly engaged in fashioning a common policy, not by some overall, overarching strategic design, but by jointly responding to a specific problem. Under Carter, we started to do so regarding the Panama Canal Treaties. But then we did not go beyond that, and we did not obtain a bipartisan foreign policy. An effort of this kind has not even been made by this administration. But beyond that, a bipartisan foreign policy can only be achieved if the President stakes out in a credible and clearly understood fashion a foreign policy that is discernibly middle of the road. Only a middle-of-the-road policy in the United States can be a bipartisan foreign policy. A democratic policy that veers to the left, that overemphasizes principle and underemphasizes power, is not the basis for bipartisanship. A Republican foreign policy that veers to the right, that underemphasizes principle and talks a great deal about power, let's leave aside whether it does anything about it, is also incapable of achieving bipartisanship. It is only by combining the two in a fashion that's palatable and understandable to the public that the President can actually achieve that which is very badly needed in this context of our global foreign policy dilemmas. I would even hazard the guess that the first President to recreate a bipartisan foreign policy may well be the first President in some decades to have a second term. For domestic support of the President on foreign policy establishes a basis that electorally is much stronger than when such support is lacking, and I know that only too well. It is only in that context, it seems to me, that we as a country can then mount the kind of response that is needed to the prolonged and sustained challenge of complexity the challenge of an engaged America in a turbulent world which needs new forms of cooperation, which are challenged both on the levels of principle and of power. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, sure. Okay.
Dr. Brzezinski will now entertain questions. In the interests of broad participation, I do ask you to keep the questions brief, and we will make a limit of one question per questioner. In the interests of directness and informality, Dr. Brzezinski will recognize the questioners himself. Zabid?
All right, who wants to start? All right, right there. The question is, under what conditions would the Soviet Union feel compelled to intervene militarily in Poland? Well, first of all, I don't really like the word compelled, because a subtle implication of the use of that word is that somehow or other the Soviet Union has no choice, the poor little thing, but to intervene in Poland. I don't think the Soviet Union is compelled to intervene at all. I don't think it should. I think it might, however, when it feels that the authorities in Poland are not able to cope with the business at hand. And that, in turn, makes it very important how that business at hand is defined. And I think we in the West, to an extent, can influence that. If we make it very clear that we are profoundly concerned and that our relationship with the Soviet Union will be affected, whether that operation is a limited one or whether that operation is an extensive one, then it may, to an extent, affect Soviet calculations. This is why, to repeat, I feel we ought to be concentrating much more on the question whether under the cloak of silence something profoundly ugly is taking place in Poland, and something which beyond that is likely to have very negative implications. Because if it is ugly, then it's likely to escalate, and if it escalates and the Soviets then intervene, then we have a much more serious crisis than we have so far. So we should be registering our concern unambiguously and making it clear that we view the Soviet Union as engaged by proxy, and that if this matter doesn't stop at a point which is still tolerable, even if unpleasant, then it will affect the nature of the East-West relationship, in the first instance economically. My colleague and former colleague here at Harvard, Kissinger, this Sunday, said that arms control negotiations should be suspended and economic relations terminated. My own view, at least for the moment, is that the latter certainly should be involved, that it's very difficult for me to envisage a situation in which we would continue to provide grain to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is engaged in this, or to supply American elements to the pipe deal between the West Europeans and the Soviet Union, and I find it very difficult to imagine that the West Europeans could justify sustaining the Soviet economy in that context by their own credits. And we ought to make that very clear now, rather than later. I can't see people on the third floor, so if you really want to be recognized, kind of wave your hand or something, but in the meantime, somebody right there. Well, unlike Professor Thompson, I was there when Mr. Carter met with President Brezhnev. And I can tell you that Mr. Thompson's account is entertaining but fictional. And that, I take it, disposes of the rest of the question. It just isn't so. Yes, sir. The question is, I've emphasized the Soviet threat to world peace, etc., but isn't this country also in a position or occasionally warmongering with the kind of, what did you call it, mindless, did you say? Yes, warmongering of Haig, Reagan, and Weinberger. Well, these distinguished incumbents are not necessarily my choices for the posts. But I don't think I would entirely agree with your categorization of them. By and large, though America has made quite a few errors in its policies and has occasionally engaged in actions in which it shouldn't have, and some of which I endorsed at the time, I think it is fair to say that there has rarely ever been a country in known history which had such preponderant power and did not assertively exercise it. The United States had fantastic preponderance, without precedent in history, in the 50s, and it didn't do so, didn't use it. If anything, under certain conditions, we perhaps underreacted. For example, if it is true that Cuba is a threat to the United States, it would have followed that we should have done something about it. We didn't. So that I don't think, by and large, it is fair to characterize either our performance as warmongering or some of the perhaps occasionally intellectually unsophisticated rhetoric of the present incumbents as warmongering. I don't agree with some of their concepts. I don't applaud some of their formulations. But they haven't done anything in the course of the last 8 months that would justify the label warmongering. If I would criticize them, I would occasionally say they haven't done enough of anything to react to, and perhaps that would be the problem in the longer run. Yes, ma'am.
I realize there's a great difference between being out of government and in government.
Yes.
There were many people who would have liked a number of speeches of this frankness during those 4 years, and I wonder if you have any thoughts of the abilities that you have perhaps to speak now than when you...
Well, first of all, I appreciate what you say, and I really do so seriously because I often felt that way myself during those 4 years. And the basic problem with a public official addressing an audience on the record when holding office is that you do have to speak on behalf of national policy, and that in turn, as a practical matter, means that you have to clear your speech with your colleagues. And you can be absolutely certain that anything intellectually creative, somewhat innovative, is going to be extirpated. It's going to be extirpated for 2 reasons. One, because policy always has to be framed in cautious and prudent terms, and I'm very serious about it. And secondly, it will also be extirpated because your colleagues, to the extent that they can insist that you take it out, are occasionally guided by more conventional human emotions. That is to say, they don't want you to make a good point, they don't want you to star, etc. And they prefer that your speech be just as dull as the one that they would be likely to deliver. Needless to say, I'm not thinking of anybody in particular. Yes? The question is, should Richard Allen resign? I don't want to comment on that because I very genuinely feel very sorry for the situation in which he finds himself. I think that if one looks very carefully at the accusations that have been made against him, they cumulatively create an impression which I think is unfair in regards to him. I think there is an obvious political problem that's arisen as a consequence of the various specifics involved, but I think that any comment by me at this moment would be in poor taste, and I don't think would be fair to an individual who's obviously going through a very, very difficult time. Yes.
At the beginning of your talk, you said that the Russian system is pretty well sterile and it's not capable of taking over the world, and yet the military system is capable of causing us a great deal of trouble. What kind of strategy would you recommend in dealing with that, keeping in mind that in Munich in the 30s we went too strong the one way, and yet in the 50s we set off an arms race that's led the last 30 years to these stages and things. What would you recommend?
I don't think I have anything particularly drastic or dramatic to recommend. It seems to me that in dealing with the Soviet Union, we face, first of all, the traditional conventional requirement of maintaining a balance of power, which permits us credibility when we say to the Soviets that certain actions are not tolerable or certain forms of political intimidation will not be countenanced. Now, how much that then requires is a difficult judgment call. But by and large, I would say that what we need to make sure of is that neither we nor our allies conclude that Soviet power is such that the threat of use of that power by the Soviets compels us either to desist from certain actions or to accommodate to certain actions of theirs. I do not fear the Soviets acquiring a power capable of destroying us in a war, because as far ahead as I can see, we'll always have the capacity to inflict unacceptable damage on the Soviet Union. But I do think that there is this much more nuanced political psychological dimension at work, in which a margin of superiority could become translatable into political advantage. So point of departure is maintenance of sufficient force to make sure that this margin doesn't exist. On that basis, then, negotiations to see if we can stabilize that relationship through arms limitations agreement and then arms reduction agreements. And then beyond that, it seems to me, we should have a much more active, affirmative Western policy of encouraging change within the communist world. The events in Poland show how sterile and unappealing the Soviet-type system is for any relatively advanced society. What is it, for example, that the Polish workers are asking? I was looking for coming here this evening at a public opinion poll that was just taken among workers of Solidarity. And let me read you just what they're asking for I think these demands themselves reveal how sterile and unappealing the Soviet-type system has become. The demands which were most frequently cited were the initiation of legal action against those guilty of embezzlement and abusing the law, and that's particularly senior officials. The increase of wages, social security and pension benefits. The improvement of relations between the church and the government. The increase of society's influence and pressure on the governmental decisions and participation in the making of these decisions. Economic reform after that. After that, activizing the parliament. After that, improvement of information from the mass media. Now, these are demands which are inherent to the operation of any normal society. And I think that these demands having to be made and now being forcibly suppressed tells us a great deal about the inner vulnerability of the Soviet system. And therefore, we should have no fear about a protracted historical competition with that system. It is bound to change, provided its force is not permitted to be employed to change international conditions. And that is exactly where the balance between the needs of defense and a more assertive doctrinal or ideological position needs to be struck. Okay, anybody up there? I can't see. All right, fine.
Yes, you spoke of the needless arming of Taiwan. Would you say that there's needful arming for any country?
Of course, there are some countries that are more threatened than others, and one can make a judgment about that. For example, I can envisage, and I feel the continuous need for providing defense assistance to Israel, given the vulnerable position it is in, the exposed frontiers that it has, and the hostility that it has experienced. Taiwan is relatively secure. It has 120 miles of water. It has a relatively advanced military establishment. It has an adequate air force, and it is not threatened militarily at this stage. So I think one can make distinctions between countries that need support for defense and countries that do not. I think the situation on the Central Front in Europe is quite different. because of the buildup of the Warsaw Pact. There's nothing in Chinese deployments to indicate preparations either for a naval amphibious operation or for an air attack on Taiwan. So I think we can make these judgments on the basis of intelligent conclusions as to what is necessary and keeping in mind our broader geopolitical interests. And clearly, in the present strategic balance, a good relationship with China is very much in our interest, and the shaping of a broader strategic coalition between China, Japan, Western Europe, and the United States is very much in the interest of world stability. Yes?
If you were an advisor to Chairman Brezhnev today, what foreign policy would you recommend to him, first in the next few weeks, and then in the next few years?
I don't feel that I should give him better advice than he has gotten. I would have some recommendations for him, but I'm sure he wouldn't accept them. So I don't feel why I should try to improve on his foreign policy. I don't care for it. I don't think it is a contribution to world peace to deploy a large number of SS-20s targeted in Western Europe, thereby creating the kind of concern that is now sweeping Europe. And I certainly don't believe the kind of policy that the Soviets have been pursuing.
President Reagan recently said that he wouldn't allow Saudi Arabia to become another Iran. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
No, I can't really comment on it because I don't have a very clear notion of what President Reagan had in mind, if he did. Yes? Do you want to tell me what you're asking, or?
In those countries, the U.S. government is in a position to do things it is not in a position to do in total.
Yeah. Okay, I get your point.
The question is, do you share that sympathy? And, well, if the U.S. were to do it,
Yeah.
it would put its stand on Poland.
No, I understand what you're saying. And let me say this. In an article that I wrote recently in New York Times Magazine a week and a half ago, I said something which I actually said in the Situation Room in the White House a year and a half ago, when we were confronting first the problems of Nicaragua and then the problems of El Salvador. And I said then that, in my judgment, the United States could not credibly support the desire for human rights of Polish workers in Gdansk if it was indifferent to the desire for land of the peasants in El Salvador and Nicaragua. And it's been my view. I told the Mexican government when we were negotiating with it that in some respects I recognize that our position nationally vis-à-vis Central America has been like that of the Soviet Union towards Eastern Europe. But we are correcting it. We as a nation have come to realize that this is not the kind of relationship that can be maintained indefinitely, though with very small nations, but nations that are becoming politically activated. And the best proof of that are the Panama Canal Treaties. The Panama Canal Treaties are an initiative by a very powerful country to redress an imbalance in its relations with a very weak and defenseless country. When we started the effort to obtain ratification of the Panama Canal Treaties, only 4% of the American people supported us. And yet we won them over to that. And we obtained twice, with one vote majority only, 2/3 vote of the Senate to ratify the Canal Treaties. The reason we stopped supporting Somoza was because we recognized that Somoza is the beneficiary of a condition created by force of arms in the 30s, which is no longer viable in the 70s and 80s. The problem, however, that we face is that as we disengage from Central America, and as we begin to recognize the authenticity and legitimacy of internal political and social grievances, that the process of our disengagement may be accompanied not only by internal and massive political unrest, but by an external political strategic intrusion. And this is what makes our disengagement so difficult. And this is what creates these uncertainties and pulls and holes. And I think it's a legitimate problem to recognize. I don't believe that the right attitude is to say the countries concerned need social reform and political reform, and therefore we don't care what happens when we leave, but we should leave. I feel we should leave. We should disengage. But we cannot afford to be indifferent if our disengagement is followed by a strategic intrusion of political systems which in any case are not democratic and first of all are hostile to us. How to combine the two is so difficult. And this is why I think we have to work very hard, particularly with like-minded democratic Latin American countries like Venezuela, Colombia, and others, eventually Mexico, though Mexico is very reticent right now, to create a framework which somehow substitutes for the role that our presence played in the region. And that's going to be a very difficult and painful process. But I do think that the American position in the region is significantly different, and look what is happening right now, from the position of the Soviets in Eastern Europe. We are in the difficult process of disengaging. But we recognize the difficulty, but we are disengaging. The Soviets are reasserting their authority. And in that sense, their role is unhistorical and dangerous. Yes?
It appears in the 1970s that one of the newest issues is the question of per capita income. What role does the problem of international poverty play in your strategic vision that you outlined in this lecture? And what role do you think the United States can play in this problem?
I have long felt that the United States ought to have a more sympathetic attitude than we have now, and to some extent we even had when I was involved, towards the third world, largely because it is simply a matter of recognizing reality to say that by the end of the century we're going to be living in a generally politically activated world in which 3/4 of that world are going to be organized in nation-states in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Therefore, it is self-interest as well as principle that dictates a positive attitude towards a process of accommodation. At the same time, I also feel that it would be misleading and idle for the United States to endorse and to commit itself to dangerously misleading abstractions such as the new international economic order. For the new international economic order cannot be created deus ex machina. It cannot be postulated in advance. It can only emerge as a consequence of a prolonged process of gradual accommodation. And that accommodation cannot entail a significant transfer of available resources from the rich countries to the poor, because human nature being what it is, expectations differ, and the advanced countries simply will not impoverish themselves willingly in order to help the developing countries reduce that gap. And therefore, our efforts have to be designed at the deliberate promotion of greater productivity, creativity in the third world. This doesn't mean doing more in foreign aid than we've been doing by far. And I'm very concerned about the cuts in foreign aid. And I felt that even under the Carter administration, our level of foreign aid was insufficient. But it means a progressive, positive engagement. I also do feel that a great deal is involved simply in the question of attitude. I think it is to the great credit of Vance and Young, for example, that they were able to project an attitude of concern and empathy for the third world that currently we seem to be unwilling to project, or in some cases almost seem to be deliberately cultivating the opposite attitude. I think even an attitude of positive interest is very important in altering relationships. It can make for a more accommodating interaction in which then the demands of the developing world become less radical, less strident, and accommodation becomes easier. At the same time, we should have no illusion. This is going to be an endless process. We have enormous difficulty in eradicating glaring and unfair inequities in our own society, though we are terribly rich. Doing the same on the global scale is going to be the task for generations. But the important thing is to be engaged in it, to move the process forward, and to have the United States perceived as being an active participant in that process. And in that regards, I think we are deficient. Some of our allies are way ahead of us.
I think the next question will have to be the last one.
Okay, anybody on the third floor? No, third floor. Yes? Okay. Okay. Well, first of all, I really don't accept your premise. It's quite possible for a national security advisor to get along with the Secretary of State. If the Secretary of State does what he should, there should be there would be no problem. And most of the time, during the 4 years I was in the White House, I didn't feel I had any problem. Now, I think there is a problem right now, and that's for a different reason, and I'll explain it quite seriously. There are essentially two types of decision-making that we have had since World War II. One type is that of the actively involved president, who himself gets engaged in day-to-day issues, is interested in foreign policy, studies the briefs, wants to make not only strategic but tactical decisions. That is Nixon, Carter, Kennedy. And under those presidents, the central predominance of the White House is unavoidable. And therefore, the National Security Advisor, not because of any intrinsic talents of his, becomes an extension of the president. It's bureaucratically the fact that if you phone up the Secretary of State when you're working for such a president and you say to him, next week you're speaking to Gromyko, the president wants to read your talking points, send them over. He's going to send them over because the president wants to see them and he knows the president wants to see them. He will then get them back rewritten. Now, he may not know who rewrote them. He may have suspicions as to who rewrote them. But if he knows the president's interested and his national security advisor works closely with him, he can't really contest it. And that happens over and over again on telegrams, meetings, and so forth. So an actively involved president is one type of decision-making system. The other one is the one I call secretarial, and that's a system in which the president reserves for himself essentially the strategic, large decisions, but doesn't engage himself in day-to-day issues, doesn't get concerned with tactical decisions, doesn't really get deeply involved in briefs, meetings, and questions. And in that case, the National Security Advisor can't do very much at all. If he were to phone up and say, the president wants to see your talking points before you meet Gromyko, a self-respecting Secretary of State would say, go to hell. I know he doesn't, and I'm not going to send them to you. So there is no friction either. And that was the system, quite seriously, that prevailed under Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Ford, with the Secretaries of State, Acheson, and Dulles, and so forth, Kissinger, being preeminent. And either system is quite respectable, either system works. What has been perplexing about the last 8 months, and again, I'm being very serious, is that we have neither the first nor the second system. We clearly don't have the presidential system of a deeply and actively engaged president. But we don't have a secretarial system with the secretary given the opportunity to exercise decisive, coordinating influence and policy initiating influence. We have had a system which is much more balanced and in some respects checkmated. That is to say, an able and an assertive Secretary of State being very deliberately checked largely by the President's domestic political advisors, not by the National Security Advisor, because under a passive President, the National Security Advisor really does not have too much clout. But the Secretary of State currently is checkmated by the domestic advisors. And this has been, I think, debilitating. And this is why I have repeatedly urged, and it shows how analytically dispassionate I am about the matter, that under the prevailing system, it be the Secretary of State that be clearly designated as the coordinator and the initiator of policy. Something which need not always be the case, and something which was not always the case. Thank you.